Hello, and welcome to the Geocurrents lecture series on the historical geography of U.S. presidential elections. Today's lecture covers the period from 1952 to 1964, or in other words, from the stable 1950s into the turbulent 1960s. I left off the previous lecture with this slide showing the situation in 1948 when the Republican Thomas Dewey was widely expected to win and win by a large margin. But the Democratic candidate and incumbent, Harry Truman, prevailed, and we have one of the most famous newspaper headlines in U.S. journalistic history, with Truman happily holding up the Chicago Daily Tribune with its headline, "Dewey defeats Truman," which of course did not happen. So Truman had been unpopular, gained popularity in his electoral bid in 1948. But then it dropped again, his popularity. A lot of this had to do with the Korea War. The United States public was not eager to remain in war so shortly after World War II ended. But Truman felt it was his duty to resist the spread of communism, and the U.S. went to war again. By late 1950, Truman's approval rating had dropped down to 35%. With most Americans not wanting to continue the war effort. In 1958, the Republicans made significant congressional gains. They didn't gain the House. They were coming up from such a deep deficit. But you can see Republicans won 28 seats. And after the election, the Republicans had 199 seats to the Democrats' 235. In the Senate, the Republican gain was proportionally even larger, with 5 seats gained and within 2 Senate seats of the Democrats, 49 to 47. And you could see the Republicans doing very well across their traditional strongholds in the Northeast and Midwest, and a real North-South division in that House map. The Senate map a little more evenly balanced. The Republican nomination battle in 1952, as had happened in 1948, pit the members of the internationalist wing against the more conservative so-called isolationist wings. I put isolationists in quotes because they certainly didn't want total isolation of the U.S., but they wanted a relative withdrawal from international or global affairs, if you will. And the so-called isolationist wing of the Republican Party was dominated by Senator Robert Taft of Ohio, often dubbed Mr. Republican. Quite conservative and wary of foreign ties. And you could see from the map that Taft did very well in the Midwest, his home base. Eisenhower, interestingly, did very well in the Northeast in the few primaries that were held there. Eisenhower, a very interesting political figure, was extraordinarily popular as the leader of U.S. forces in Europe, and had just won a resounding victory over Nazi Germany in the war. And after victorious wars, as we have seen in this class, leading generals have often been recruited into the political arena, and many have become president. Interestingly, both the Democrats and Republicans had shown some interest in Eisenhower. Nobody really knew what his political positions were. He was quite apolitical. But he ultimately declared that he was a Republican and does enter the race and narrowly wins the nomination. Republicans by this time were much more concerned with victory than ideology. They had been losing election after election, including one they thought they had in the bag in 1948. And so victory was their primary concern. The Democrats had a nomination battle as well. The leader going into the convention was Estes Kefauver of Tennessee. And he won the primary battle. It's very clear. You can just see on the map from the Northeast through the Midwest and the Far West. Most of these elections went for Kefauver. And Kefauver was well known. He might be regarded as something of a liberal populist, but more importantly as a fighter against corruption. He had taken on party bosses and revealed their connections between big city democratic machines and organized crime. And as a Democrat, it won him no affection from, of course, those party bosses in the large cities, and that meant there was a lot of opposition. It was sort of said at this time, I think Adlai Stevenson said it, that to win the nomination, one had to satisfy at least two of three branches of the Democratic Party. And the branches were the liberals, the party bosses in the large cities, and the South, the Southerners. And Kefauver lost the lost the party bosses, and he also had some problem with the Southerners. There was a Southerner himself, but he was quite opposed to racialism or racial segregation. And the Democrats instead turned to Adlai Stevenson, who was a reforming governor of Illinois. He was the grandson of a previous Democratic vice president from the previous century. Kefauver was himself also very much opposed to racial segregation and the lack of civil rights for Black Americans, but he pushed it less, not quite, with not as much vigor as Kefauver. And one of the reasons was he knew that he needed to maintain support from the South, and in the South, nominated by white voters, very hesitant, well, more than hesitant. We saw this in 1948 when in the Deep South there was a mass defection from the Democratic Party to the so-called Dixiecrat or States' Rights Party of Strom Thurmond. Adlai Stevenson was a popular public speaker, had a reputation as a very intelligent, well-read man, or as an intellectual. He's also quite courageous. For example, he vetoed a loyalty oath bill for public employees, which was quite popular in the electorate. But as Stevenson said, does anyone seriously think that a real traitor will hesitate to sign a loyalty oath? Anti-intellectualism did figure fairly prominently in this campaign, as Stevenson was derided as an egghead. This charge was made by Connecticut Republican Stuart Alsop in reference to both Stevenson's baldness and the fact that he had an intellectual attitude. An egghead was an insult for intellectuals at the time. And Alsop's brother Joe, who's a journalist and newspaper editorialist, spread the term, and it meant that Stevenson had more difficulty attracting working class voters than had Truman or Roosevelt. I mean, the party under Franklin Roosevelt had become the party of the working class, but Stevenson was sort of successfully portrayed as someone who was out of touch with that class because of his intellectual airs. It's very important to note that in this election, the second Red Scare was roiling the nation. This was part of what is generally called McCarthyism after Wisconsin Congressman Joe McCarthy, Senator Joe McCarthy, who was leading congressional hearings on the infiltration of communists into the U.S. government and into U.S. media, Hollywood in particular. You can see the illustration here of a poster saying, don't patronize Reds or communists and keep them out of television, radio, and Hollywood. McCarthy was relatively successful at first, but he kept pushing the charges further and further. And in 1954, he took on the Army and claimed there was extensive communist infiltration in the Army. No real evidence for that. The Army turned against him, as did the Senate. They voted to censor him by 67-22. And that's pretty much the end of McCarthy and McCarthyism. But other politicians, particularly Richard Nixon, sort of kept up the attack, and anti-communism continued to be a major feature, especially of the Republican Party through this period. It also led the Democrats to be quite defensive about that, and they wanted to shore up their own anti-communist credentials. And I do want to note that debates over how extensively Soviet spies had infiltrated the U.S. State Department continue to this day. A main figure here is Alger Hiss, who was ultimately convicted not of espionage, but rather of perjury, as often happens. After the downfall of the Soviet Union, a number of archives were opened up to public scrutiny, even by scholars from the West, particularly those on something called the Venona Project, which was about U.S. counterintelligence efforts. And a number of scholars came to the conclusion that the Venona papers showed that Alger Hiss was indeed a Soviet spy. Other scholars have cast doubt on this. So as a little experiment here, I just said, well, what would ChatGPT say? And you could read it here. They say that, yeah, it's a complicated issue and we really don't know for sure. In the 52 presidential campaign, Republicans attacked the Democrats on communism, corruption in Korea. And Democrats, in turn, attacked the Republicans for unfounded red baiting. Also of note that Stevenson attacked the Republicans over their political division. The GOP elephant has two heads nowadays, and I can't tell from day to day who's driving the poor beast, Senator Taft of Ohio or the general, meaning Eisenhower. And you can see here in the campaign posters, the Democrats are portraying the Republicans as the party of Hoover and depression and breadlines and homelessness, and the Democrats as the party of Roosevelt of higher wages and better homes. So the depression and the U.S. Climbing its way out of the depression under Democratic leadership is still figuring very prominently. And it's interesting, the poster I have here from the Republicans is all about sort of masculine power, put real men in government who will serve all of the people, no more clowns and cut-ups or characters. Kind of interesting. I'm not sure who they're referring to in that sense. I put this up partly because I have another slide which will tell you a little bit about how in 52 and in 56, the Republicans were also trying to appeal to women voters, more so than any other party had ever done. At any rate, Eisenhower wins convincingly in 1952. We have something of a return to the political map of the 1920s when the Democrats pretty much only took southern states and the Republicans took most of everything else. Although note that Stevenson didn't win the whole South. Florida is changing. Northerners are moving into Florida by this time, and so it's becoming more of a swing state. Eisenhower also took Tennessee and Virginia, which was somewhat unusual. Note West Virginia, going for Stevenson. West Virginia by this time has an economy heavily dependent on coal mining, and unionization is very strong among coal miners, and West Virginia is going to become a Democratic stronghold and remain that way pretty much all through the 20th century, although today it is, along with Wyoming, the most Republican voting state in the country. So yes, things have changed. In 1952, Eisenhower's victory, no surprise that the Republicans take control of the House, gaining 22 seats, and pretty sort of decisively taking control. And again, you could see in the eastern half of the country, anyway, a real return to this north-south division, although with a few blue congressional seats in the north and a few red, and some of these traditional Republican voting areas of the upper South, eastern Tennessee and parts of Kentucky, for example. The Democrats actually gained 2 Senate seats, though, and the Democrats have control of the Senate, so it is not a trifecta by any means. Interesting to see that in New York City, the Republicans had actually gained congressional seats. You could see in the northern Bronx and in parts of Queens and Brooklyn, Staten Island. There's one dark blue Democratic gain in Queens, and the Democrats overall have more congressional seats, but it's far more evenly divided than it had been previously and would become later on. Notice even Manhattan has a couple of red congressional seats here. As I mentioned before, the Eisenhower campaign was really the first to explicitly seek women's votes, and they did this by focusing on education, on inflation, which was a problem after World War II, and on ending the Korean War. And there were a lot of sort of women's voters groups that were mobilized and were campaigning as women. In 52, the female vote was pretty much the same as it was for the general vote, including men. It wasn't much difference. But in 56, actually, Eisenhower had a bit of an edge among women over men. very interesting compared to what's going to come on about later. So today there's a substantial gender gap, and it's women preferentially voting for Democrats and men for Republicans, and we'll examine that transformation in coming lectures. Eisenhower campaign, both in 52 and 56, used television advertising extensively. In the first campaigns to do this, television was a relatively, well, it was a new medium after World War II, but it's spreading really rapidly in the 1950s. It's becoming ubiquitous. I would recommend people go to the Wikipedia article on this election, and you can view one of these campaign. It's a cartoon. It was co-produced by Roy Disney, brother of Walt Disney. It was animated by Disney artists, and really has that look. It's essentially without content. It's simply people telling us how much they like Eisenhower. There's nothing about politics or policy in it. Stevenson detested these ads. He said, well, they're selling the presidency like cereal. But then he went on to emphasize that he never watched television, which is one of the sort of things that was used in these accusations of Stevenson being an out-of-touch intellectual, because television is mass media at this time and is extraordinarily popular across the country. It made him seem out of touch. So even though there's this very clear north-south divide, in the Republican voting north and west, there are a number of Democratic voting counties, some quite strongly. And I just have some call-outs to note this. Areas with economies based on mining, with highly unionized miners, and also processing of ore and so on. The Mesabi Range in northern Minnesota, that's going to major iron ore mining area, which is going to go on and still to this day be a stronghold for the Democratic Party. I'm not going to mention all of these counties, but you could, in Utah, eastern Utah, for example, you could see a county. It's called Carbon County. That tells you what you want to know. It's a coal mining county. Another one in Wyoming. We have the copper mining area in around Butte and Anaconda, Montana, West Virginia, obviously. And I've also noted some industrial counties here with strong unions, like Contra Costa County in California, with a lot of oil refineries. County in Indiana with Gary, Steele County, Wayne County with Detroit, Cuyahoga County in Ohio, Allegheny County in Pennsylvania, major industrial areas with strongly unionized workforces. I've also done a couple call-outs in the South. One is to the surprisingly large number of Republican voting counties in South Carolina. And it seems to be people were concerned about Stevenson's personal opposition to segregation and support for civil rights. Eisenhower had the same personal opposition to these. Neither of the candidates were going to push it too hard, although Eisenhower, we'll see later, did address it in several ways. But there's sort of a nervousness in the South, and we saw this in the 1948, where the South had basically, the far South anyway, had seceded from the Democratic Party to join the so-called states' rights or Dixiecrat Party of Strom Thurmond. I've also noted the German Hill Country in Texas. I've talked about that many times, and that strongly Republican voting pattern. And then one parish, as counties are known in Louisiana, in far southern Louisiana, which is very interesting because it had the highest percentage of the vote for the Republican candidate, Dwight Eisenhower, 93%. Why is it? Well, it was essentially controlled by a political boss, Leander Henry Perez, who had been a Democrat, bolted it in 1948 over concern with Harry Truman and his desegregation of the U.S. military and other ideas he had about reducing racial racial policies in the South. It's interesting too. I'll actually quote from the Wikipedia article on this because it's important to know. It tells you something about how an individual county or in Louisiana parish could just be extraordinarily corrupt. So elections under Parrish's reign were sometimes blatantly falsified, with voting records appearing in alphabetical order and names of national celebrities like Babe Ruth, Charlie Chaplin, Herbert Hoover appearing on the rolls. His candidates often won 90% or more. Those who appeared to vote were intimidated by his enforcers. He sent tough men into voting booths to help people vote. Many were bribed. We're not talking about democratic governance at the parish level in southern Louisiana at this time. Eisenhower governed as a centrist, essentially. He retained the high tax rates, which were established in World War II to pay for the war effort. He maintained the New Deal, but he did not expand it. He didn't want any further extension of that. But you could see on the graph here of the highest marginal income tax rates, you can see how they skyrocketed up to 94% in World War II, dropped a little, but in the Eisenhower level, they're being maintained. I think it's at 92%. That doesn't mean everyone in the highest income tax was paying that. There were a lot of loopholes and the like, but they were still very high tax rates. And actually, this was a period when the gap between the rich and poor was declining in the United States. They're still deeply divided, but much less divided than it had been in the 1920s or the Gilded Age in the late 1800s. Roosevelt also created the Department of Health, Education, and Welfare. He signed the Federal Highway Act of 1956, which poured a huge amount of federal money into the interstate highway system. This was very important in things like encouraging suburbanization, but also integrating the country, at least from a trucking and automotive perspective. He pursued balanced budgets. That's a more classically conservative or Republican issue. But he also sent federal troops to enforce school desegregation in Little Rock, Arkansas, which did not endear him to Southern white voters by any means. The 1950s was a period of very strong economic growth, increasing mass prosperity, most people benefiting greatly. But it also was marked by a couple of fairly sharp but short recessions. The business cycle was much more active in earlier periods than it was to become. We've talked a lot about this class, about how every 10 or 15 years one would have expected a economic recession or depression. And in this decade, there were two. They were fairly short, but you could actually see two periods of decline of real gross domestic product. And when those things hit near an election, they can really cause a change. In the 1954 midterm election, the Republicans lost 19 House seats and control, and they lost 2 Senate seats. So consequences to what the economy is doing. 1956 saw a rematch, Eisenhower versus Stevenson, same candidates. Stevenson at this time is pushing for an increased spending on social programs. Let's take the New Deal a few steps further. He also wanted to reduce tensions with the Soviet Union. He wanted to end nuclear testing. He wanted to end the military draft. So running much more from the left at this time. Eisenhower was helped by international events, though. In 1956, the Soviet Union sent tanks into Budapest, Hungary. Hungary had become a Soviet ally after World War II because of Soviet machinations, but the Hungarians wanted a more liberal, open society, and the Soviets showed that they would not have it. And so when you have an international crisis like this tends to lead a lot of voters to want to have continuity in the presidency. Also, there was something called the Suez Crisis, where Britain, France, and Israel together took over the Suez Canal from Egypt. This was a big global crisis, and the Eisenhower administration came down against this effort by Britain, France, and Israel to control the Suez Canal because it was so harmful for the U.S. in overall global opinion. This is a period of decolonization, and this was seen as a colonial move, and Eisenhower took a pretty strong stance against it. It was humiliating for Britain and France. They had to withdraw. But anyway, by 1956, the recession is over, the economy is booming. Eisenhower is showing himself to be the kind of strong but careful leader that a lot of people want. And it's very similar to 1952. But it's not in the congressional elections. Actually, the Republicans lose two more House seats. It's pretty similar to the map. You could see Stevenson has lost a couple of states, West Virginia and Kentucky. He's gained Missouri, but it's still it's a landslide in the Electoral College, and Eisenhower actually gained a few more percentage points in the popular vote. If you look at the county return, you can see the same thing I've been talking about in South Carolina. It's also in Mississippi, a bit of Alabama, one county in Tennessee. But it's unpledged electors who don't like either candidate. They're worried about the coming end of segregation. Interesting how well the Republicans did in Louisiana and in places like Western North Carolina. If we look at the Northeast, it's just really an extraordinary map. It's only a few counties here. Counties either that contain or within large cities. Well, 3 cities here, Boston, New York, and Philadelphia. That's the only blue you see on the map. Even Baltimore red on the map. And Eisenhower actually won 21 of 39 cities with populations over 250,000 in 1952, and he won 28 of them in 56. So partly because of Eisenhower's moderation and the fact that things are going generally very well in the 50s. There's a lot of concern about international issues, but the domestic economy is doing quite well. California is also really interesting to compare 1956 and 1924 because you see almost an inversion of the map, where in 1956, Stevenson, the more liberal candidate, did very well in the San Joaquin Valley in the south central part of the state. A lot of that had been resettled by Southerners in the Dust Bowl. Did quite well in a number of sparsely populated mining, logging, and ranching counties in the Northeast. By 2024, and I should say too, Eisenhower did extremely well in the centers of population and economic power in the Bay Area. For example, Marin County, north of San Francisco, very affluent county, 66% for Eisenhower. And Eisenhower winning all southern counties as well. And then compare it to 2024, where those what had been red coastal counties are now all blue, and what had been blue interior counties are now almost all, a few exceptions, but almost all Republican voting. Another crisis occurred in 1957 with the Soviet Union launching the first satellite, Sputnik. This was a total shock. It led to fears that the U.S. was falling technologically behind. Excuse me, I need to... So anyway, fears that the U.S. was technologically falling behind. Both the U.S. and Soviet Union were really pushing space issues at this time, mostly using German scientists who had been captured after World War II. Because Germany had been the leader in rocket technology. But it was just a shock that the Soviets did this first. You can see the New York Times mentioned Sputnik 279 articles between October 6th and October 31st in 1957. Combination of the recession of 1958 and the Sputnik crisis, the Democrats make huge gains in Congress. You could see 49 seats. They now have an overwhelming 283 to 153 lead. This is similar to what was situation in the Great Depression. So the Republicans had clawed back a lot of seats after the Depression in a couple of elections, but then have lost most of them. And you can see the Democrats gaining massively across the Northeast and Midwest in areas that had been Republican strongholds. And then in the Senate, oh my gosh, Democrats winning 15 seats. And they have almost twice as many seats as the Republicans do. So this is a big shock to the Republican Party. And that sets us up for the 1960 election. And that election in the nomination process for the Democrats, as we all know, goes to John Kennedy or Jack Kennedy. One of his major competitor was Hubert Humphrey of Minnesota. Kennedy was the more conservative or centrist candidate. Hubert Humphrey was strongly associated with a civil rights program. He had pushed it through in the convention of 1948 that led to the Dixiecrats rebelling from the party. Kennedy, younger, more centrist in orientation. But you could see Kennedy winning most of the primary contests in the Northeast and the Midwest and Oregon. Not all of them. Humphrey is not campaigning very actively or not doing well. You could see taking South Carolina, and that is all. There is a lot of concern about John Kennedy's Catholicism. No Catholic had been elected. Remember, Al Smith was nominated in 1928 by the Democrats and lost overwhelmingly, and there was a tremendous amount of anti-Catholic, of campaigning accusations that the Pope would be controlling the presidency. Accusations were not nearly as extreme. Things had really mellowed out, if you will. I think came from World War II, when people of different regional, religious, ethnic backgrounds were serving together. It was a period of much stronger sense of national unity. Humphrey, though, really gambled heavily on the primary in West Virginia, which is one of the most Protestant and is still states in the Union, only about 4 or 5% Catholic. First televised primary debate. It's widely regarded that Kennedy won that debate and the primary. Kennedy was able to outspend and out-campaign Humphrey across the country, partly because of his very large and very wealthy and politically engaged family. Kennedy surprises many by picking Lyndon Johnson, who was one of his rivals for the nomination, as his VP candidate. They mistrusted each other. There's really no doubt about it. Johnson, though, was widely regarded as the master of the Senate, a real very effective political operator within the Senate. And it was thought that Johnson would help balance the ticket. Being a Southerner from Texas would really help him. Kennedy's campaign themes were really a mixture of left, right, and center. One of the things he pushed was the new frontier of space exploration. Wanted to catch up with the Soviet Union. My third line here is the so-called missile gap. He claimed that the Soviets had a lot more missiles aimed at the United States. That probably wasn't true, but he really claimed the U.S. had to catch up, both in exploring space and being ready for nuclear war. He also pushed on reducing poverty, enhancing education and civil rights, so traditional, what had been since from Franklin Roosevelt, traditional Democratic campaign points. Yet he also wanted a tough stance on the spread of communism. The Democrats were vulnerable to this because for a variety of reasons. But Kennedy wanted a tough stance, but he also wanted to enhance the non-tough side of that tough stance, if you will. I know that doesn't make much sense, but he emphasized creating stronger alliances. And one of his signature programs was the Peace Corps, the idea that idealistic young Americans should go to poor countries and help them raise their economic and educational standards and show the world that the United States offers a superior model to the Soviet Union in economic and social development. Yet he also wanted to stimulate the economy through tax cuts, as well as infrastructure and educational spending. I'll talk about that a little bit later on. And he emphasized the importance of passing the torch of political power to a new generation. He had been in World War II and was quite young, and emphasized his youth. In the Republican side, the vice president under Dwight Eisenhower, Richard Nixon, easily wins the nomination. You could see he did very well in primary elections, winning most of them. His strategy was essentially to be fierce anti-communist in the international arena, but in the domestic arena, somewhat similar to Eisenhower in pursuing a sort of a more moderate policy. I was deeply distrusted by many and had already earned the nickname Tricky Dick, and that came out of his 1950 California Senate race against Helen Gahagan Douglas, who he accused of being a communist sympathizer and engaged in all sorts of sort of tricky things. If I remember right, at one time Nixon, during this campaign, Nixon sent out tens of thousands of pink postcards denouncing Douglas, pink being associated in those days with being soft on communism. A communist is red, a pinko is somebody who's a sympathizer of communism. I do want to mention Helen Gahagan Douglas a little bit here because she's a very interesting political figure. There are very few women in positions of power at this time. Actually, women's economic power and autonomy had increased during the World War II period when many of them were taking jobs that were necessary that had been abandoned by men who were fighting. The 1950s is sort of a return of women to the more of a return to the domestic sphere. But Helen Gahagan Douglas certainly bucking this trend. She had been a very popular Hollywood star. I have a movie poster of a movie called She. She was Helen Gahagan at this time. Douglas was her husband's name. She took that to go into politics. Her role was sort of the prototype of the evil queen used in Disney movies later on. She was disgusted by Hollywood. Was an accomplished singer, trained for opera, and actually was successful enough. She was on a tour in Europe, and in Vienna encountered the rising Nazi movement that really pushed her into politics. She comes back to the States. She's mentored by Eleanor Roosevelt, and she was elected to the House for a few terms, and people were starting to, in the Democratic Party, talking about her as a potential vice presidential candidate. But she was really pilloried by Nixon in the 1950 senatorial election, who claimed she was pink right down to her underwear. That actually wasn't even his own term. One of her Democratic contenders for the senatorial nomination had levied the same charge. Nixon's campaign themes were sort of a mixture of right wing and center. Experience and continuity, low inflation and steady growth. These things had happened under the Eisenhower administration. Wanted a moderate government role, but also strong defense against communism, a peace through strength attitude, and wanted civil rights reform, but very gradually done. Nothing to upset the Southern white supremacists too much. Very famous televised debates, 4 of them in this election. It had not been a feature of presidential elections before, but it's going to become so now. It's interesting that television viewers surveyed afterward thought that Kennedy won, and radio listeners evidently thought that Nixon had won. This is the first debate. The usual story is that Nixon had been somewhat ill, had been campaigning up to the last minute, didn't really prepare enough, but also refused things like makeup. And under the harsh lights, he looked rather sickly. Kennedy looked healthy, and at least among television viewers, I thought that he won the debate. He does go on to win the election, but at a razor close margin. You could see the percentage of the popular vote, 49.7 to 49.55. Electoral votes, clear Kennedy victory, but wouldn't have taken much to switch it the other way. Nixon and many Republicans alleged that there was massive fraud in Chicago, controlled by the Richard Daley Democratic political machine, which supposedly delivered the votes. But Nixon decided not to pursue this issue in the interest of the country. There's also a lot of what we can see on the map here, sort of unprecedented deregionalization There had been deregionalization in the Great Depression when almost every state went for Franklin Roosevelt. But before the Depression and afterwards, you saw in the eastern half of the country, particularly, this very strong north south divide. And it's pretty much gone on this map. Note that in Mississippi, all the electors in Alabama, the majority bucked both parties and went for Southerner Harry Byrd. I've talked about him before. But you could see Kennedy taking, as is normal for a Democrat, a lot of states in the South, but also most states in the Northeast, almost all of them, a lot of Midwestern states, not much in the West. So there is the question here, was the West turning Republican in 1960? Well, as I say here, not exactly, because you could see in the House election, the Democrats gained seats in the West, a few, not much. In general, though, the Democrats, although they won the election, note that they lost House seats. And the Northeast, although rejecting Nixon, is tending in the House a bit more back to the Republican side. Republicans gained 2 Senate seats as well. In this 1960 election, Kennedy does quite well in large cities and industrial and mining areas. That's been typical in Catholic areas. So there are a number of rural counties in places like North Dakota that had not normally been, at least for the last few elections, had not been in the Democratic side, but they are now. And of course, much of the South, but note the unpledged electors in Mississippi distrusting both. And if we can use a cartogram showing population level, and I note that San Francisco is not accurately scaled, it should be vastly larger than that. I have a post on the problems with these cartograms in my blog GeoCurrents if you're interested in it. But I brought this in just to show that Kennedy's victory in major cities is clearly visible here. You can see the very large Cook County in Illinois in the center of the map. Counties of New York City, in not just in Boston, but in surrounding counties in Massachusetts. Very clear Kennedy victory, and no surprise, he's from Massachusetts, Catholic majority by this time. Also, Kennedy doing well in the across the far south. I do want to talk a little bit about the aura of Kennedy, his what I put here, sort of carefully cultivated charisma. I mean, he did have a real ability to project optimism and idealism. So as this Kitty Kelly quote notes, John Kennedy brought style and charisma to the White House and a first family that captivated the country, a handsome, witty president, an elegant first lady, and 2 adorable young children. So we have their relative youth and sort of stylishness and polish and charisma. And this leads to the idea that this is sort of a new Camelot that's coming in. That's something that still resonates through the years, but it was played up at that time. There has been a lot of reconsideration of this idea of this very charming first family was hiding some skeletons in the closet, if you will. For example, it's pretty well known that John Kennedy had a number of lovers as senator and as president, including Marilyn Monroe. Although he projected health and vitality, he was not particularly healthy himself. He had Addison's disease, he had back problems, he was getting a number of injections, including probably amphetamines. So that there's a lot of debates and talk about these issues. Kennedy's accomplishments in his few years in the presidency were mostly on the left. Equal Pay Act, a Housing Act, first of several Clean Air Acts, a nuclear test ban treaty, established the Peace Corps. I put in right here the Revenue Act of 1962 because this would be usually considered, at least by today's standards, something of a more conservative or right-wing bent. But notice that Kennedy and Johnson, his successor, really brought down income tax rates, top marginal income tax rates. They are still over 60% by the end, but that's a big drop. And this was done to stimulate the economy. One could say they're really quite successful because the economy did boom during the Kennedy years. It had been doing very well previously, but that continued under him. Although by the time you get to the end of Johnson's presidency, you're starting to have a problem with large expenditures, both military expenditures and social expenditures, combined with a decrease in the income tax rate. That's starting to lead to problems of inflation and less rapid economic growth. I'll talk about that later. Kennedy also really pushed a physical fitness program, contending that the people in the U.S. were becoming out of shape and they needed to maintain this. This is actually something similar to something Theodore Roosevelt had done much earlier. And interestingly, his nephew, Robert F. Kennedy Jr., in alliance with Trump, is now pushing that again in his Make America Healthy campaign. 62 midterm congressional votes. There's little change, which is generally a sort of a good sign for Kennedy. He's popular. He's doing well. The U.S. is doing well. He is assassinated, as everyone knows, in November 63, which is a shock to the country. Vice President Johnson, vice president, becomes president. And Johnson's priorities are to push through the civil rights agenda that Kennedy was starting to do, but to a relatively modest extent. And Johnson said, well, now, with the nation in shock over Kennedy's assassination, that can be done. But at the same time, he thought to maintain the support needed for his push to further the agenda of the New Deal agenda, if you will, of Franklin Roosevelt, which I'll talk about in a few minutes. He thought that the U.S. really had to be quite aggressive in stopping the spread of communism in Southeast Asia, particularly in Vietnam. Before Johnson is elected in 64, after he takes the presidency after Kennedy's death, he signs into law the Civil Rights Act of 64, the first of several very important Civil Rights Act. And he bolstered NASA. He also had more tax cuts following Kennedy in several regards. If you look at the Civil Rights, the Senate vote on the Civil Rights Act of 64, it's very interesting to see, no surprise to see the pattern. The entire South, with the exception of Tennessee, both senators voted no. Texas was split, as were a few, but most of the states in the Northeast, the Midwest, and the West, both senators voted yes. So they're very clear regional divisions, which are not surprising at all. From today's perspective, it may be surprising to see, though, that a much larger percentage of Democratic senators voted no, 21 to 46, and the Republicans was 6 as opposed to 27. And this largely reflects the fact that there were still a lot of conservative, certainly socially conservative senators from the South. In August of 64, the Vietnam War really heats up. This comes about as a result of what was known as the Gulf of Tonkin Congressional acts, leading to intensive U.S. involvement, which basically gave the presidency carte blanche to do what was thought necessary to stop the spread of communism. So what had happened in Vietnam was after World War II, communist forces in the North, with support from China and the Soviet Union, essentially defeated the French, who were the colonial powers, trying to come back in. The country was divided into North Vietnam, communist, and South anti-communist or non-communist, if you will. But the war continued. There were communist rebels in the South. They were supplied by the North. Northern troops would come in. Kennedy administration had sent advisors to help the non-communist South Vietnamese government, but the war wasn't going particularly well, and Johnson wanted more. There were 2 naval clashes in the Gulf of Tonkin off the coast that allowed this resolution, which is what the slide should say. The second one of those was almost certainly faked, though. It didn't actually happen. So here we do have a Republican revolution in a way which is as jarring as the Democrats turned to populism. And what I mean by this is the triumph of Barry Goldwater in the 1964 Republican convention. So, of course, this begins with primary elections. There are a few more of them now, but you could see in that gold color, fittingly, Goldwater does very well in the West. Parts of the Midwest, does not win any of the elections in the Northeast. And this shows you a big division in the Republican Party, with the Northeast being the home of the traditional Republican establishment, if you will. And in the Midwest and the far West, you have a much more right-wing Republican movement, and which is greatly strengthening at this time. So you can think of this nomination of Barry Goldwater from Arizona as being a revolt against the East Coast Republican establishment, with members of Congress known as Rockefeller Republicans. This is after Nelson Rockefeller of New York, who was sort of the leader of this group. And these are moderate to somewhat liberal, in some cases really quite liberal Republicans. Remember in an earlier period there was a tremendous amount of ideological overlap between the two parties. So so-called Rockefeller Republicans would have included Thomas Dewey, who ran for presidency in 44 and 48 and lost both times. Henry Cabot Lodge Jr., Massachusetts, son of the famous Republican Senate leader Henry Cabot Lodge. William Scranton of Pennsylvania, George Romney of Michigan, Mitt Romney's father, Jacob Javits, Jewish senator from New York, John Lindsay, mayor of New York, who eventually becomes a Democrat as the Republicans become more conservative. Goldwater said the Republicans, Rockefeller Republicans, are trying to be all things to all people, so eager to compromise they don't even know what they stand for. And what Goldwater represented really as an ideology that's sometimes called fusionism. And this was essentially created by William F. Buckley and his newspaper, the National Review. So this was bringing together in one party, well, you can see how Buckley said it, an extraordinary mix of libertarians, people who want classic liberalism, government deregulation, government out of the economic sphere, and traditional social conservatives, anti-communists, sort of all coming together under this umbrella, this fusionist umbrella. Buckley gained fame shortly, as a very young man, shortly after graduating from Yale, writing a book called God and Man at Yale, claiming that anti-Christian secularists were taking over universities and undermining traditional views. So this was a new strand of conservatism, and it did definitely have its extreme aspect. And while Goldwater very famously declared at the Republican convention that, well, to quote him, I would like to remind you that extremism in the defense of liberty is no vice, and let me remind you also that moderation in the pursuit of justice is no virtue. And this is in a country that had really, well, certainly in the 50s, had been characterized by sort of a move to the center to a very large extent from both parties. And Goldwater is saying, no, we need to move away from that, and we need to take a very strong conservative stance. And up to the extent even of inverting the normal Republican model and turning to what had been the Democratic model of states' rights. So as I've talked a lot in previous lectures, from the very beginning of the creation of the Republican Party, it was wanted sort of more central or federal authority than the Democrats, who wanted more state autonomy. And Goldwater inverted that and said wanted more, less federal authority, particularly for the South, particularly in regard to civil rights. So it was a very bitter battle at the Republican National Convention. You could see here from the floor we have voters from, these are mostly voters from places like New York and Pennsylvania, who are saying stay in the mainstream, and then the more Midwestern ones, really pushing for Goldwater, who gets the nomination. One of Goldwater's taglines was, "In your heart, you know he's right." Democrats responded with "In your guts, you know he's nuts." Uh, this was a very, very bitter campaign, and the Democrats really did what they could to undermine Goldwater's standing. In fact, you see, over 1,000 psychiatrists saying he's psychologically unfit. He's an extremist. He could provoke a nuclear war at any time with the Soviet Union. There was a famous ad. I probably should have showed you the Daisy ad with a girl picking a daisy as nuclear bombs erupt in the background, because Goldwater wanted more confrontation with the Soviet Union. The result is a Democratic landslide it's unprecedented because there have been plenty of Democratic landslides, but there's certainly never been under Roosevelt in particular, but there's never been a Democratic landslide where the Democrats win every state except those in the Deep South and Arizona. So Goldwater wins the electoral votes of South Carolina, Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana, and his home state of Arizona. And that was largely because he had embraced a states' rights platform. Basically, again, like many before him, saying that he was personally opposed to segregation and racial discrimination, but this is a state issue, not a federal issue, again, inverting what the Republicans had traditionally stood for. And note that Lyndon Johnson, although a Southerner, is from Texas, which is not as intense in its antipathy towards black voting and civil rights. And he also picks his running mate Hubert Humphrey, who from Minnesota was long noted for his support for civil rights. That was really what he was known for. So it's a very, very blue map. You can see even many areas of the South. It's interesting though. It's Mississippi here that is the deep red Republican voting state, much more than South Carolina, which is intriguing. Some traditionally Republican voting counties in the Midwest. Most of these are sparsely populated agricultural counties, but not all of them. In the Southwest, you could see Maricopa County with Phoenix. Also, you get California, you can see San Diego County and Orange County, which were long most conservative counties in California. I'll talk about those later on. We're coming near to the end of this lecture, though. But I wanted to throw in a cartogram, which can show you those really red counties in the South. They're small, so that means they're fairly sparsely populated. Larger red counties you can see on the map are some of the suburban counties to the west of Chicago. Cook County with Chicago very definitely blue, but just to its west, a number of fairly well-populated counties. Again, you could see in California, San Diego and Orange counties, Maricopa County in Arizona. The redshift blue shift map is unparalleled. It's a massive redshift towards the Republican Party in the South, particularly in the Deep South. Although notice that Eastern Virginia is also in that category. I'm a bit perplexed by the redshift in Idaho. Those are actually quite sparsely populated and very deeply conservative counties to this day, but it would be interesting to look a little bit more about why they had the shift and a few other interesting outliers, but in the interest of time, I'm not going to go into them. It is notable, though, that the red shift in 1964 at the county level, in the Southeast anyway, really does correlate pretty well with concentrated areas of black population. Blacks were beginning to see some enfranchisement, but that's going to take a long time. And the Southern white political establishment did not want that to happen. And so it's in particular states where there's a very large black population that there's most antipathy on the white side, the voting white side, to prevent this from happening. And in my last slide, I just want to note a few of the demographic features here. We can see total vote overwhelmingly for Johnson, and in every single category in this map, Johnson outpulled Goldwater. The biggest gaps, though, were in terms of race. So with the black population, the black voters are 94 to 6%. And remember, those are mostly in the outside of the South, because in the South they're just beginning to get voting rights. Catholic vote also overwhelmingly for Johnson. The closest that Goldwater came, he still lost by 4 points, was with college educated voters. So this traditional linkage of Republicans with the wealthier and more educated segment of the population is still holding, although it's not going to hold forever, as we will talk about in remaining lectures. So thank you for listening to this, and I hope you can listen to other lectures in this Geocurrent series on the historical geography of U.S. presidential elections.